Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book, The Stories That Shape Us. The subtitle is Contemporary Women Write About the West. I bought this book for $8.40 at a used bookstore in Taos, and I want to say that as a specimen, this book is kind of uninteresting. There's no evidence of any prior ownership, aside from this little wear in the top corner. I don't know if it'll pick up on that. There's a bit of wear on that corner. Barely any indication of this ever having been owned before. I will add that the cover photograph is from 1996, Mark Klett / Swanstock. And this book is copyright 1995. The book designed by Beth Tondreau Design. This is first published as a Norton paperback in 1996. And it's an anthology, a collection of essays written by women from across the West and from very different backgrounds. It is more progressive leaning in its politics, but that's kind of more in a conservation and libertarian mindset. So a lot of the Western mindset is very libertarian, and for the most part, it is kind of liberal in cultural values, a bit conservative in family values, but even then, a lot of people in the West are very open and accepting because life's hard enough as is. You don't need to make it more complicated with additional problems. It says in the introduction, I am a Westerner. As I look at the many terms that describe me, woman, writer, wife, feminist, environmentalist, rural advocate, Westerner comes close to the top of the list, if not at its pinnacle. When I first meet people, I always want to know where they are from. I don't mean to be nosy, I'm not passing judgment. It just seems that home should matter to them because it matters so deeply to me. As someone born into the mythic West, a Wyoming rancher's daughter, the fourth generation in the same house on the same piece of land, I grew up with certain confidences and assumptions. That I belonged to a place. That I was competent in nature, which is to say, with large spaces, large animals, and large weather. That as a descendant of pioneers who had stuck it out, I played a role in the American dream. I grew up with certain insecurities as well, which paradoxically derived from many of the same things that gave me confidence. If I had the pride of place, I also had the shame of place that many rural people share. The fear of being backward in the eyes of the larger, more sophisticated world. Still, however this mixture of pride and shame balanced out, I was confident that I was a real Westerner. It takes courage to tell stories where there has been silence before, and many of the essays in this collection address that fear. When the poet Judith Barrington ventured from her home in Portland, Oregon, to teach in rural and small town schools in eastern Oregon, a part of the state she loved, she consciously hid her sexuality. She feared that if her students and their families knew she was a lesbian, her job and even her life would be in danger. And then it goes on with more. As we approach the dawn of a new millennium, the challenges that greet us seem almost overwhelming. Our population keeps increasing, even as we deplete the earth that supports us. We must live together in new ways if we are to live at all, shaped by stories of nurture and interdependence rather than conquest. When shifting paradigms, the historian Patricia Nelson Limerick has quipped, it is important to remember to put in the clutch. Stories ease our passage from one way of seeing ourselves to another. We have included some of those stories here. Only some. This is just a beginning. Have a good trip. And this book, like I said, it emphasizes this in the introduction if you were to read it in full. These stories are about Black women, Asian women, Native American women, white women, Hispanic women. They're about poor, they're about suburban, rural, and to a much lesser extent, urban. They're about married women, childhood traumas, sexual abuse, about living as an independent and single woman, living as a single mother, living as someone who has left their church, someone who has done so many things in their life. All of these women are facing challenges, but through those challenges have come out with a way that they can express themselves and be remembered and discussed for years afterwards. The only name I personally recognize in this is Terry Tempest Williams. The women are so varied. I hadn't read many of these women, and I don't think I'm going to find them or reach out to find more writings by them, but this book is fascinating. Like I mentioned earlier, it is from 1995, so contemporary isn't quite accurate. It's not modern 2020s Western women. It's the story of women that grew up in the 20th century, in the 1900s, and their stories that they want to pass down to the to the aughts, to the 2010s, to the 2020s. So it's important to be able to use this as a resource. And I think of it in very similar ways to the book that I discussed last year, The Ways of My Grandmothers, where in that case, it was one First Nations woman who was talking to the older women in her tribe, in her band. That way she could pass down their wisdom in a written form. Each chapter focuses on one author primarily, so it introduces the chapter by the author and then an introduction about them. Then it follows up with the actual essay. So I turned to a random page and it has the chapter on Nancy Mears. And then it discusses her early life, and then it says, "In my writing," Mears says, "I aim to speak to the unspeakable in defiance of polite discourse, so as to expose ways in which my personal experiences inscribe cultural values dangerous to women and other creatures worth preserving. As this essay from her new work in progress attests, like her writing, Mears' life is itself a triumph of classic Western American virtues, like rugged individualism, self-reliance, and cooperation, not to mention of style, candor, thought, and even form." One of these, which I really appreciated, was by a woman named Mary Crow Dog. "If you plan to be born," Mary Crow Dog says only half jokingly in her autobiography, Lakota Woman, "make sure you are born white and male." And then it goes on into a description. It says, "It's hard being an Indian woman," she says. The essay is titled "Civilize Them with a Stick." And this is from Lakota Woman, that autobiography. It opens with what almost looks like a poem. "Gathered from the cabin, the wickiup, and the teepee, partly by cajolery and partly by threats, partly by bribery and partly by force, they are induced to leave their kindred, to enter these schools and take upon themselves the outward appearance of civilized life." Annual Report of the Department of Interior, 1901. It is almost impossible to explain to a sympathetic white person what a typical old Indian boarding school was like, how it affected the Indian child suddenly dumped into it like a small creature from another world, helpless, defenseless, bewildered, trying desperately and instinctively to survive, and sometimes not surviving at all. I think such children were like the victims of Nazi concentration camps, trying to tell average, middle-class Americans what their experience had been like. Even now, when these schools are much improved, when the buildings are new, all gleaming steel and glass, the food tolerable, the teachers well-trained and well-intentioned, even trained in child psychology, unfortunately the psychology of white children, which is different from ours, the shock to the child upon arrival is still tremendous. Some just seem to shrivel up, don't speak for days on end, and have an empty look in their eyes. I know of an 11-year-old on another reservation who hanged herself, and in our school, while I was there, a girl jumped out the window trying to kill herself to escape an unbearable situation. That first shock is always there. And this goes on to describe that experience from a woman's perspective. I've discussed it before in other books, in A Zuni Life, which I discussed a couple years ago, I want to say. The author describes his own experiences with the Indian school in Albuquerque and his efforts to modernize them from a native perspective with native authority and with some ability to affect that change. But it is a different experience depending on who is the one telling the story. And in this case, it's tragic. It is undescribably sad. And I wish I could do it justice. I'm not even sure the author believes she can do it justice in writing, that it can only approximate what she felt, but that the trauma was so much that it can never fully be told to someone else that didn't experience it. And it's really sad about that. At some point in time, they ended up having an ally, a young priest that was willing to work with the natives to help them out. She says, oddly enough, that priest turned out okay. He taught a class in grammar, orthography, composition, things like that. I think he wanted more respect in class. He was still young and unsure of himself. But I was in there too long. I didn't feel like hearing it. Later, he became a good friend of the Indians, a personal friend of myself and my husband. He stood up to his superiors, stuck his neck way out, and became a real people's priest. He even learned our language. He died prematurely of cancer. It is not only the good Indians who die young, but the good whites too. It is the timid ones who know how to take care of themselves who grow old. I am still grateful to that priest for what he did for us later, and for the quarrel he picked with me, or did I pick it with him? Because it ended a situation which had become unendurable for me. The day of my fight with him was my last day in school. So even in such a terrible situation, they have allies, and it's never enough. It expands your mind and opens your eyes in a way that I really love, and it's why I read these books, so that I can learn from other people. And I really love this book. I spent $8.40 on it. I don't know what it would have cost new, but I know I really enjoyed it. And I think if anyone who is listening to this is interested in the perspectives of women in the Western United States across all walks of life, this is an important book to pick up and read. It might be a bit dated because it is a lot of early to mid 20th century, but it is very valuable regardless, and it is very timeless. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.